New Year's Eve in Michigan was always cold, but the community center buzzed with warmth. Inside, the biggest party of the year was underway. Glittering lights twinkled from the rafters, and the air was thick with the smell of spiced cider and the sound of laughter. The town of Maple Ridge didn't have much, but it always had this night to bring everyone together. In the corner of the crowded room, Carol Anderson sat with a forced smile plastered on her face, her hands wrapped tightly around a half-empty glass of champagne. Her friend, Ella, lounged beside her, cracking jokes and casting flirtatious glances across the room, but Carol barely registered any of it. She felt like a shadow of herself, lost in her thoughts, which were as frigid as the winter air outside. It used to be different. Years ago, she and her husband, Gary, had been the life of these parties. They'd dance until their feet ached, laugh with friends, and steal kisses under the mistletoe. But now, they felt worlds apart. Gary, who had always been so open and loving, had grown distant. And Carol, well, Carol had secrets that gnawed at her like a festering wound. Across the room, Gary was in his element, surrounded by a small group of friends near the bar. He was smiling, but there was a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Something had changed in him, and Carol could sense it. He knew, or at least he suspected. Carol turned her gaze to Ella, who was sipping her drink lazily. "You need to relax, hun," Ella said, nudging Carol's arm. "It's New Year's Eve. Everyone's here to have fun." Carol forced a laugh. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking." Ella gave her a knowing look. "Still worried about Steve?" The name sent a chill down Carol's spine. Steve Daniels. The man she shouldn't have touched. The man who had been married to Misty, one of the strongest women Carol had ever met. Misty had always carried herself with grace, even when her world fell apart after Steve's betrayal. Carol, on the other hand, felt like she was drowning. "I can't believe I was so stupid," Carol whispered, her voice barely audible over the din of the party. She swirled her drink, watching the bubbles rise to the surface. "What have I done, Ella?" Ella shrugged, her expression unconcerned. "What everyone else does when they're unhappy. You find something exciting." But it wasn't that simple for Carol. She wasn't like Ella, who seemed to flit from one affair to the next without a care in the world. Carol had loved Gary, still did in a way. But there was something in her, some deep, aching need for something more, something thrilling, that had led her into Steve's arms. Her stomach churned as she thought about Steve. He had been distant ever since his divorce with Misty, trying to rebuild his life, while Carol was left picking up the pieces of her shattered conscience. As if on cue, she spotted Gary, now standing alone at the bar, watching her. His eyes flicked between her and Ella with a glint of suspicion, and Carol felt her heart skip a beat. He knows, she thought. Or at least he suspects. Gary had always been a simple man. He loved working on his Mustang in the garage, taking the kids fishing, and spending quiet evenings at home. But recently, he had become more withdrawn, more guarded. He wasn't the kind of man to confront issues head-on, but Carol knew he was keeping things bottled up. As the night wore on, Carol's guilt weighed heavier. She glanced at the clock on the wall. Midnight was approaching, and with it, the traditional countdown and fireworks. The town would celebrate, people would kiss, and Gary would likely pull her close for a hollow kiss that would mean nothing. In that moment, Carol wished she could turn back time. She wished she could erase the affair, undo the damage she'd caused. But she couldn't. The damage was done, and now, she had to live with the consequences. Across the room, Gary's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and then made his way to the back of the room, out of sight. Carol's heart raced. Where was he going? "Relax, Carol," Ella muttered. "You're acting paranoid." But Carol wasn't so sure. Something was wrong. Very wrong. In the back hallway, away from the noise of the party, Gary stood in the dim light, his face unreadable as he listened intently. Just moments ago, he'd overheard Carol and Ella talking, her regrets about Steve, the affair that had haunted her. The confirmation hit him like a punch to the gut, but Gary didn't let it show. His face remained a blank slate as he tucked his phone back into his pocket. His suspicions, which had been eating away at him for months, were now confirmed. Carol had betrayed him. But he wasn't going to explode, not yet. Gary was a patient man, and if there was one thing he had learned from working on cars, it was the value of precision. He would handle this like a broken engine, methodically, one piece at a time. He would gather proof, expose the truth, and when the time was right, he'd confront them all. As the clock neared midnight and the crowd began their countdown, Gary made his way back into the main hall. He caught sight of Carol and Ella, sitting close, laughing at something only they found amusing. He clenched his fists but forced a smile as he approached. "Hey, thought I'd bring you ladies a drink," he said smoothly, placing 2 fresh glasses in front of them. Carol smiled at him, but Gary could see the guilt behind her eyes. She wasn't fooling anyone, least of all him. The countdown reached its final seconds, and as everyone cheered and fireworks exploded outside, Gary leaned in and kissed Carol. The kiss was brief, cold, and full of unspoken tension. Carol felt it too, the distance between them was undeniable. As the town celebrated, Gary's mind was already working, calculating. This was just the beginning. The crowd at the community center began to thin out as the New Year's Eve party neared its end. Carol and Ella remained seated at their table, chatting quietly, while Gary moved about the room, making small talk with neighbors and friends, but always keeping an ear out for Carol. He was still reeling from the earlier conversation he had overheard and was itching for more confirmation, more proof. At one point, Carol excused herself to use the restroom, and Ella, ever the provocateur, wandered off to refill her drink. Alone at the table, Gary noticed Carol's phone buzzing with a message. He leaned over subtly and glanced at the screen. The message was from Steve. Gary clenched his jaw, barely containing his frustration. It was one thing to suspect, it was another thing entirely to have the evidence staring him in the face. He quickly noted Steve's number before stepping back, making it look like he hadn't seen anything. A moment later, Carol returned, sitting down with a sigh. Gary acted as if nothing had happened, but his mind was racing. He needed more, something irrefutable. As the party began to wrap up and people said their goodbyes, Gary watched Carol and Ella from a distance. He saw the way they huddled together, their heads close, talking in hushed tones. Unable to resist, Gary stepped outside to cool off and smoke a cigarette. The chilly Michigan air bit at his skin as he lit the cigarette and walked toward the back of the building, hoping to clear his head. As he stood there, contemplating his next move, voices drifted toward him from the shadows. It was Carol and Ella, and their conversation carried just enough for him to make out bits and pieces. "I don't know what to do, Ella," Carol's voice was thick with anxiety. "I feel like Gary's already figured it out." Ella scoffed. "Even if he has, what's he going to do? You've been careful enough. Besides, Steve's just a fling. It's not like it matters in the long run." Carol didn't answer right away, and Gary could sense the weight of her guilt in the silence. "I wish I hadn't done it. It's tearing me apart," Carol finally said. "I love Gary, but Steve, he was just different." Gary felt a surge of anger. His suspicions were now confirmed beyond doubt. Carol had cheated on him with Steve, the same Steve who had wrecked his own marriage with Misty. Gary's cigarette burned down to the filter, and he crushed it under his boot. The plan for revenge began to form in his mind. He would get proof, real, undeniable proof, and then he would expose everything. But it wouldn't just be a confrontation. No, he would tear their lives apart the way they had torn his heart. His mind raced with ideas. Maybe he would start recording her phone calls. He could install a camera in the garage or maybe even her car. Gary's heart pounded with the thrill of setting his plan in motion. He wasn't just going to confront them, he was going to destroy them, emotionally, mentally, and socially. As Gary walked back into the party, he noticed Steve standing awkwardly near the bar. Their eyes met for a moment, and Gary forced a thin smile. But inside, he was already plotting his next move. In the following days, Gary became a man with a purpose. Every moment he was near Carol, he felt the simmering betrayal inside him, but he kept it buried, masked beneath a calm exterior. He installed recording apps on her phone, something she wouldn't notice. Every text, every call would be captured, and with each passing day, Gary grew more determined. He wasn't going to lose his temper and let things explode too soon. This would be precise, calculated, like tuning an engine for the perfect moment to unleash its power. The first recording he listened to shattered any last bit of doubt. Carol and Ella were on the phone, discussing another get-together with Steve. They spoke in code, but the meaning was clear. Carol was planning to meet him, and Gary knew where it would be. He clenched his fists, feeling the weight of their betrayal crush him. He wasn't going to let this go unpunished. Later that evening, while Carol was out running errands, Gary decided it was time to confront Steve. He drove over to Steve's modest apartment on the outskirts of town. The door opened after a few knocks, and Steve stood there, looking surprised but not alarmed. "Gary?" Steve's voice had a nervous edge, and it was all Gary needed to confirm that Steve knew something was wrong. "Mind if I come in?" Gary said, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. Steve hesitated but stepped aside. The apartment was sparse, a reflection of Steve's post-divorce life. Gary scanned the room quickly before turning back to Steve, who was fidgeting with a beer bottle. "I know about you and Carol," Gary said bluntly, watching as the blood drained from Steve's face. For a moment, the room was silent except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. "Look, Gary," Steve started, but Gary cut him off. "Shut up." Gary's voice was quiet but dangerous. "You think you can just wreck my life and walk away?" Steve took a step back, raising his hands defensively. "It wasn't like that. Carol." Before he could finish, Gary's fist connected with Steve's jaw. The impact sent Steve stumbling backward, crashing into a table. Gary stepped forward, looming over him, the calm facade finally breaking. "Stay away from my wife, or I swear, Steve, you'll regret it." Steve, clutching his jaw, nodded quickly. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice shaky. "I didn't mean for it to get this far." Gary stared down at him, his fists still clenched. "You'll suffer more than this, Steve. You just don't know it yet." Leaving Steve bruised and shaken, Gary walked out of the apartment, his mind already thinking ahead to the next part of his plan. Steve wasn't the only one who was going to pay for this. At home, Carol felt the coldness between them deepening. Gary was distant, but not in the way she expected. There was no angry outburst, no accusation. Instead, there was something unnerving about his silence, his calm demeanor. He would leave for hours at a time, saying he had errands or car work to do, and come home with the same eerie coolness. Carol's guilt began to fester. She had once found excitement in her affair with Steve, but now it felt like a black mark on her soul. Gary's silence was worse than any confrontation. At least then, she could defend herself, explain, apologize. But this was unbearable. Ella, ever the instigator, continued to push Carol. "You need a night out. There's another party this weekend," she said over coffee one morning. "Let's go. You can't just sit around and wallow in guilt." "I don't know, Ella," Carol replied, her voice weak. "Gary's acting strange. I feel like he knows something." Ella waved her off. "You're overthinking it. If he knew, he'd have said something by now. Look, you need to forget about it and have fun." Carol hesitated. Part of her wanted to refuse, to stay home and try to fix what was left of her marriage. But the thrill of excitement still tugged at her, even though she knew it was wrong. "I'll think about it," she muttered, not fully committing but feeling the pull. Meanwhile, Misty reappeared in Gary's life. She called him out of the blue, wanting to catch up after hearing through the grapevine about his troubles with Carol. They met for coffee, both exchanging polite pleasantries before diving into their shared experiences of betrayal. "I never thought Steve would cheat on me," Misty admitted, her voice soft but bitter. "But it looks like he hasn't changed." Gary nodded, a bitter smile on his face. "And now he's ruining my life, too." They talked for hours, bonding over their mutual pain. There was something comforting in Misty's presence, the way she understood his anger, the way she didn't judge. As they sat in the cafe, a quiet understanding grew between them. Gary didn't need to say much, Misty already knew how deeply he was hurting. But something else was growing too, a subtle romantic tension that neither of them acknowledged but both felt. It was nothing obvious, just a lingering touch of their hands or a glance that lasted a moment too long. For Gary, Misty represented everything Carol had once been: loyal, grounded, and strong. The more time they spent together, the more he found himself drawn to her, even though it was complicated. But revenge, not romance, was his focus now. As the weekend approached, Gary had everything he needed. Carol's phone calls revealed enough to know she was meeting Steve and Ella at another one of their wild parties. He listened, seething as the pieces fell into place. Carol, Ella, and Steve were going to get exactly what they deserved. Misty, ever the calculating woman, had a plan of her own. She revealed to Gary that she had evidence from her divorce, things that could ruin Steve financially and socially. It was her final weapon, and she was willing to share it with Gary, to help him destroy the man who had betrayed them both. Together, they set the stage for the final act. Gary wasn't just going to confront them. He was going to tear their lives apart, leave them with nothing but regret. It was no longer just about betrayal. It was about justice, his kind of justice. Gary sat in the darkened garage, the glow from his laptop screen casting shadows on his face. The recordings had given him more than enough evidence. Every call, every conversation between Carol and Ella, confirmed the details of her affair with Steve. But the most damning evidence came from a phone call just hours ago. Carol had agreed to meet Steve and Ella at another party. They spoke in code, but it was obvious what the meeting was about. Carol's guilt hadn't stopped her from continuing down the same path. Gary clenched his fists as he replayed the conversation for the third time. The casual tone in her voice as she talked about their plans, it made his blood boil. But he kept his emotions in check. His plan was set. He wasn't going to confront Carol yet. No, he wanted this to be public, to expose her, Ella, and Steve in front of their entire circle. They'd be humiliated, and Gary would be the one holding the cards. As he reviewed the recordings, a knock came at the garage door. It was Misty, holding a folder full of papers. She stepped inside, her expression grim but determined. "I brought everything," she said, handing him the folder. "These are the documents from my divorce. They'll ruin Steve. Financially, socially, he'll have nothing left when this gets out." Gary took the folder, flipping through the pages. This was more than just about Carol now, it was about everyone who had betrayed him. Steve would pay for what he did to Misty, and Ella, with her reckless lifestyle, would be dragged down with them. "Are you sure about this?" Misty asked, her voice softer now. She knew how dangerous Gary's plan was, but she also understood the need for closure, for revenge. Gary nodded. "It's time. I'll meet them at the party and expose everything. After that, I'm done with her." He said it coldly, but Misty could see the hurt in his eyes. This wasn't just about rage, it was about the destruction of trust. The party was already in full swing by the time Gary arrived, parking his car a few blocks away. It was being held in a large house on the outskirts of town, where privacy was guaranteed, and the partygoers could indulge without fear of judgment. Gary had always known what went on at these parties, but he never imagined his wife would be caught up in it. He stepped inside, blending into the crowd as the music thumped and laughter echoed through the rooms. He spotted Carol, Ella, and Steve, gathered in a corner, talking in low voices. Carol looked nervous, her eyes darting around the room as if she could sense that something was off. Gary kept his distance, watching them from the shadows. He wasn't going to make a scene just yet. He had to wait until the right moment, when they were all too comfortable to notice him. Meanwhile, Misty had her own role to play. She had been keeping tabs on Steve ever since their divorce, and tonight she was ready to deliver the final blow. Armed with evidence from their past, she knew exactly where to strike. As Gary moved closer to his targets, Misty approached Steve, pulling him aside discreetly. "What are you doing here, Misty?" Steve asked, his voice laced with annoyance. He had long since moved on from their marriage, or at least that's what he liked to think. But Misty knew how to unsettle him. "I'm here to watch you fall," she said coldly, her eyes narrowing. She handed him a piece of paper from her folder. Steve's face went pale as he scanned the document, legal evidence from their divorce, things he thought were long buried. It would not only ruin him financially but would drag his reputation through the mud. "You can't be serious," he stammered, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to process what she was showing him. Misty smirked. "Oh, I'm very serious. You think you can just wreck people's lives and walk away unscathed? Not this time, Steve." Back inside, Gary was ready. The recordings on his phone played like a weapon ready to be unsheathed. He'd heard Carol's voice far too many times on those recordings, confessing her guilt to Ella, planning her meetings with Steve. Tonight would be the night he shattered the facade. He had set up his phone to record the confrontation, ready to capture everything. As he made his way closer to the group, he felt his heart pounding in his chest. But he wasn't scared. He was ready. Carol hadn't noticed Gary yet. She was too wrapped up in her own thoughts, the guilt eating away at her. She had wanted to cancel, to stay home and try to work things out with Gary. But once again, Ella had convinced her to come. Ella always knew how to pull her into trouble, and tonight was no different. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," Carol muttered to Ella, her voice shaky. "I feel like Gary's onto me. I think he knows." Ella shrugged, sipping her drink casually. "Even if he does, what's he going to do? He's not the type to cause a scene." Carol wanted to believe that. But deep down, she knew Gary wasn't the same man he used to be. Something had changed in him, and that terrified her. In the background, Gary listened to every word, a deep rage building inside him. He could hear their conversation clearly, but now wasn't the time to reveal himself. He wanted more. He wanted them to feel comfortable before he struck. Misty, meanwhile, had planted the seeds of Steve's destruction. She had left him with the damning evidence, watching him squirm under the weight of his impending doom. As Steve rejoined Carol and Ella, he was visibly shaken, his confidence crumbling. "What's wrong with you?" Ella asked, noticing Steve's strange behavior. "Nothing," Steve muttered, glancing around nervously. But Misty's presence lingered in his mind like a dark cloud, and he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to fall apart. Gary finally made his move. He stepped out of the shadows, approaching the group with a calmness that belied the storm brewing inside him. Carol's eyes widened in surprise when she saw him. "Gary? What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "I was just about to ask you the same thing," Gary said, his voice low and controlled. He pulled out his phone, pressing play on one of the recordings. Carol's voice echoed through the room, detailing her plans with Steve and Ella. The color drained from her face as the reality of the situation sank in. The room seemed to freeze around them as Gary's phone continued to play the damning recording. Carol's voice echoed in the space, every word dripping with guilt and betrayal. Ella and Steve stood frozen, their expressions shifting from shock to dread. "Turn that off, Gary," Carol's voice was trembling, but she tried to keep her composure. She reached out toward him, but Gary pulled away, his eyes burning with the anger he had kept bottled up for months. "No," Gary said, his voice cold and steady. "Everyone's going to hear it. Everyone's going to know what you've been doing behind my back." He took a step closer, towering over Carol, who was visibly shaking now. Ella and Steve exchanged nervous glances, both realizing the gravity of the situation. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," Carol pleaded, her voice cracking. "I'm sorry, Gary. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" Gary's laughter was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. "A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk. This was a choice. Your choice." Tension snapped through the air like an electric current as Gary's anger finally surfaced. The years of betrayal, the lies, the secrets, it all came pouring out. He wasn't just confronting Carol, he was tearing down the very foundation of their relationship in front of everyone involved. Gary turned his attention to Steve, who had backed up against the wall, his face pale. "And you," Gary said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "You ruined your own marriage, and now you've ruined mine. I hope it was worth it." Steve stammered, "Gary, look, I'm sorry. I didn't want things to go this far." But before he could finish, Gary lunged forward, his fist connecting with Steve's jaw for the second time in as many days. The impact sent Steve sprawling to the floor, clutching his face in pain. "Get up," Gary snarled, standing over him. "You think you can just get away with this? You think you can destroy people's lives and walk away without paying the price?" Steve whimpered, his confidence shattered. He tried to scramble to his feet, but Gary shoved him back down, the fury in his eyes wild and untamed. Carol screamed, rushing toward Gary to pull him away, but Gary shoved her aside. Ella, standing frozen, finally found her voice and tried to intervene. "Gary, stop it. This isn't the way." But before she could finish, Misty appeared from the shadows. She had been watching the whole confrontation unfold from a distance, waiting for the moment to strike. With a stack of papers in her hand, she stepped forward, her eyes locked on Steve. "You thought you could ruin me, too, didn't you, Steve?" Misty's voice was calm, but there was an edge of satisfaction to it. She threw the papers down in front of him. "These are from our divorce. Do you know what they'll do to you once I release them? Your life, your career, everything will be destroyed." Steve's face twisted in panic as he stared at the documents. He had nothing left, no defense, no way out. "This isn't fair," Steve muttered, trying to gather himself, but the fear was evident in his voice. "Fair?" Misty scoffed. "You never cared about fair when you cheated on me, when you lied to me. Now you'll get to see what it feels like." Gary stepped back, watching Steve crumble beneath the weight of his actions. But his focus wasn't just on Steve, it was on Carol, who stood motionless, tears streaming down her face. "You've destroyed everything," Gary said, his voice low and filled with a grief that cut deeper than any anger. "Our family, our trust, everything. I loved you, Carol. But you threw it all away." Carol collapsed to her knees, sobbing, the weight of her guilt too heavy to bear. "I'm sorry," she whispered over and over, but her words seemed hollow now. They couldn't undo the damage. Gary took a step back, his expression hardening. "I'm done. It's over," he said, and with those words, the final blow landed. It wasn't the punch to Steve or the documents Misty had brought, it was the realization that everything they had built was gone, reduced to ashes by betrayal and lies. As the partygoers, unaware of the unfolding drama, celebrated the new year in another room, Gary walked away, leaving behind the broken remnants of his marriage, his trust, and the people who had betrayed him. The aftermath of the confrontation left a heavy silence in the room. Carol remained on her knees, tears streaming down her face, while Steve sat slumped against the wall, holding his bruised jaw. Ella, normally so quick with a sharp remark, was uncharacteristically quiet, glancing between Carol and Steve with a look of stunned disbelief. Misty, with a sense of grim satisfaction, stood near the door, her eyes fixed on Gary as he left the room without looking back. Gary didn't return home that night. Instead, he drove aimlessly through the empty streets of Maple Ridge, his thoughts a storm of anger, betrayal, and exhaustion. The weight of everything he'd heard, everything he'd seen, pressed down on him. But one thing was clear, his marriage with Carol was finished. By morning, Gary had already made arrangements. He called his lawyer and filed for divorce, moving forward with a steely resolve. There was no going back now. The decision was final, and he intended to follow through without hesitation. At home, Carol was a wreck. She spent hours in their empty house, trying to come to terms with what had happened. The party was over, but the damage was irreparable. Gary had taken the kids early that morning, and she was left alone in the hollow echo of their family life. She had betrayed him, and now she was paying the price. The guilt she had carried for so long had finally crushed her. Across town, Ella had become a pariah. Word of the affair had spread quickly, and soon the entire community was talking about what had happened at the party. No one wanted to be associated with her, and the friends she once had slowly distanced themselves. For someone who thrived on scandal, Ella now found herself on the outside, ostracized by the very social circle she had once dominated. As for Steve, the fallout was swift. Misty followed through on her threat, using the documents from their divorce to ensure his financial ruin. His reputation was shattered, and his business suffered as the details of his infidelities and mismanagement became public knowledge. He lost his job, his home, and most of the people who had once supported him. He was left with nothing. Meanwhile, Gary and Misty's relationship took an unexpected turn. What had started as a shared bond over their mutual betrayal had grown into something deeper. They spent more time together, finding comfort in each other's company. They weren't rushing into anything, but the connection between them was undeniable. Both of them were cautious, still healing from the emotional scars of their previous relationships, but there was hope for a new beginning. One afternoon, while sitting in a quiet cafe together, Misty reached across the table and touched Gary's hand. "We've been through hell," she said softly, "but maybe we can help each other heal." Gary looked at her, the bitterness in his heart slowly softening. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of something he hadn't thought possible: peace. Carol, on the other hand, was left alone. With Gary gone, she tried to make amends with her children, but it was a long and difficult road. They were hurt and confused, struggling to understand why their family had fallen apart. Carol's attempts to rebuild their trust were met with resistance, and she realized that there was no easy fix for the damage she had caused. Days turned into weeks, and Carol's guilt only deepened. She had lost everything: her marriage, her family, her friends, and she had no one to blame but herself. Every corner of their home reminded her of the life she had destroyed. The isolation was unbearable. She thought about leaving Maple Ridge altogether, but deep down, she knew running away wouldn't solve anything. The consequences of her actions would follow her wherever she went. Gary, meanwhile, began to rebuild his life. He moved out of the family home and found a small apartment on the outskirts of town. The kids stayed with him most of the time, and though the transition was hard, Gary found solace in their presence. His anger toward Carol had not disappeared, but it had lessened. He had made his decision to move forward, and that's exactly what he intended to do. Weeks passed, and the dust from the explosive confrontation at the party finally began to settle. Life in Maple Ridge moved on, but for those involved, nothing would ever be the same. Carol sat alone in the house that had once been filled with warmth and love, now empty and silent. Her children visited, but they were distant, their hurt too deep to heal quickly. Her guilt was overwhelming, and every attempt she made to repair the damage felt hollow. She spent her days reflecting on the choices that had led her here: the affair, the lies, the betrayal. One evening, as she sat in the dimly lit living room, she stared at a family photo on the mantel. It was from better days, when she and Gary had been happy, when their life had felt whole. A deep sadness welled up inside her, and she realized that there was no going back to that life. She was left to face the consequences of her actions alone. Redemption felt out of reach, but she wasn't sure if she deserved it anyway. Whether she would continue down this path of self-destruction or find some way to rebuild herself remained unclear, but for now, she was stuck in the aftermath of her choices. Gary, on the other hand, had begun to find peace. He had moved on from the anger and the betrayal, slowly but surely. His focus was on his kids, rebuilding his life one step at a time. He and Misty grew closer, their shared experiences bonding them in a way neither of them had expected. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, but something slower, steadier, a cautious new beginning. One afternoon, Gary and Misty took a walk through the park, the winter chill still lingering in the air. As they strolled, Gary found himself talking about the future for the first time in a long while. "I think I'm ready to start over," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Not just with the kids, but with everything." Misty smiled softly. "It's time for a fresh start," Gary. We both deserve it. The new year, which had begun with so much pain, now seemed to hold a sense of possibility. Gary felt lighter, like the burden of his past was finally lifting. He and Misty decided to take things slowly, letting their relationship grow naturally. They both knew that healing took time, but for the first time, they saw a path forward, a path that led away from the betrayals of the past and towards something hopeful. Carol's fate was less certain. She remained in Maple Ridge, trying to rebuild her life, but the scars of her choices were deep. She attempted to make amends with her children, though it was a long and difficult process. Whether she would find redemption or continue to spiral into isolation was unclear. The road ahead was uncertain, a reflection of the complexity of human relationships and the difficulty of repairing what had been broken. In the end, Gary and Misty found solace in one another. They left behind the pain of their past relationships, choosing instead to focus on building a future that wasn't defined by betrayal. As they walked together, hand in hand, they knew that while their journey had been painful, it had also given them a chance at something new. The new year symbolized their fresh start, a clean slate, free from the secrets and lies that had once weighed them down. For Gary, it was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, one where trust and honesty would be the foundation. For Misty, it was a chance to find happiness again after the devastation of her own failed marriage. Together, they looked toward the future with cautious optimism, knowing that while the scars of betrayal would always be there, they didn't have to define the rest of their lives. And so, life moved forward, one step at a time. In the weeks that followed the party, Carol's world crumbled around her. The once warm and lively home felt like a prison of regret and loneliness. Gary had moved out, taking the kids with him most of the time, and Carol found herself facing the consequences of her actions in stark solitude. She had betrayed the man she loved, destroyed her family, and shattered the trust that had once been the foundation of their lives. Her attempts to make amends with the children were met with resistance. They were confused, hurt, and struggling to understand why their mother had torn the family apart. Carol tried to reach out, but the guilt she carried was too heavy, her words empty in the face of the damage she had caused. Redemption seemed like a distant hope, and every step toward it was fraught with pain and uncertainty. One evening, as she sat at the dining room table, she picked up a family photo from years ago. It was a reminder of what once was, a life filled with love and laughter, before the secrets and betrayals. Tears filled her eyes as she realized just how much she had lost. She had no one to blame but herself. Whether she could ever truly rebuild her life, or if she would spiral deeper into her own guilt and isolation, was a question that weighed heavily on her mind. Meanwhile, Gary found a new sense of clarity in the aftermath. Moving into a modest apartment, he focused on rebuilding his life with the kids. The anger and pain were still there, but with each passing day, they dulled a little more. His relationship with Misty grew, not out of a rush of emotion, but out of a shared understanding, a bond forged in the fires of betrayal. They spent time together, but it was cautious. Neither wanted to rush into something new, still healing from the wounds left behind by their former partners. Yet, as they shared quiet moments, walks in the park, and long conversations about the future, Gary felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. One afternoon, as they sat on a bench overlooking the town, Misty reached for Gary's hand. "You think we'll ever be okay again?" she asked, her voice soft, but filled with sincerity. Gary squeezed her hand gently. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think we have a chance at something better. Maybe that's all we can ask for." Misty smiled, a small but genuine smile that lit up her eyes. "I'll take that," she whispered. Carol's fate remained uncertain. She continued to live in Maple Ridge, haunted by her mistakes, trying to find a way forward. Her attempts to reach out to Gary went unanswered, and the walls between them seemed too high to break down. The path to redemption, if it existed at all, was long and fraught with challenges. Whether she would find her way back to herself or be consumed by her guilt was a question that only time would answer. For Gary and Misty, a new chapter was beginning. They were cautious, but there was a sense of peace in leaving behind the past, in knowing that they had both survived the worst and come out the other side. The new year, once marked by betrayal and anger, now symbolized a fresh start, a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to find happiness again. The scars of their past wouldn't fade quickly, but together, they were determined to move forward, one day at a time. As they walked through the quiet streets of Maple Ridge, hand in hand, the future seemed a little brighter.